I'm Melanie Swayze, a global real estate advisor with Gibson Sotheby's based in Metro Boston. I closely advise homebuyers and sellers of all stages of life, guiding them to intelligent, winning decisions.
I'm Derek Lumpkins, a real estate investor with a background in community organizing. I also enhance equity and inclusion initiatives at companies and organizations, and I guide leaders through executive coaching.
When we get together, we dive into the intersections of culture, class, mindset, and Black freedom.
Welcome to the Black Landing Forum,
a podcast about Black wealth, power, and land. Derek!
Hey, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
How's it going so far?
It's going well. I was just dancing to our intro.
Yeah. I can see you backstage. I know you couldn't see me, but I can see you. Yeah, it's a good beat. I definitely like the beat of this intro that we came up with.
Yeah, and somehow it's like marking the moment in a nice way at this. It feels winning at this time. I'm so delighted to welcome the year with you.
Same here.
And so, yeah.
There's so much going on. I mean, from 2024 to 2025, there's so much going on. And at the end of 2024, or maybe it's the beginning of it's definitely the end of 2024, I was reading an article and they referenced a quote by Zora Neale Hurston. And the quote is, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer."
Mm.
And I was like, and it was right at the end of 2024. So I'm like, what was 2024 and what will be 2025? Which one asked the question? Which one is answering? Or are they both asking questions or are they both answering? 2024, I don't know how you'd want to call it that. I think it asked a lot of questions, but I think we got some answers at the end. And I feel like 2025 is going to give us a lot more answers coming up too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think was a salient answer? I mean, obviously there were the results of the elections, but both the U.S. presidential election and other elections around the country. But what do you feel like the answer was that stood out to you?
I feel like the question that was sort of running in the background was, are we as evolved or are we as enlightened as we say we are?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is no, we're not. We're not. I mean, given the politics, given our responses to climate change, given all the wars that are going on, given all the things.
Yeah, I agree.
We're just not.
I agree.
So, and then unfortunately, we're not. I mean, I say it very glibly, but it's unfortunate that we're not.
Yeah.
So, I mean, would you say something similar or something different?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I feel that fully. And I also think that I feel at the moment that 2025 is a year of answers too, not necessarily resolutions, but more clear, blunt understanding of what's possible and what's necessary. That's what I feel. Yeah, I feel like
possible and what's necessary.
Yeah, like a further reckoning about what's at stake, and an understanding of what it's going to take to fight for what's at stake.
You know, I was looking back at a lot of the previous episodes or all the previous episodes because I was adding chapter markers and stuff like that.
Yes.
And the reason I'm referencing those is because in a lot of the episodes, you say the word reckoning. And I'm kind of thinking, when do we get to the resolution? Because, there's so much reckoning, which means to me, it's sort of like, there's so much churning, there's so much upheaval. I'm like, when do we get to the resolution? And I wonder if we ever get to the resolution.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I actually think our guest today, who's a revisiting guest, is a perfect person to be asking that kind of question with. Because I think there is so much more upheaval that needs to occur. There's so much turning out, turning open, that we're all going to bear witness to together. In the same way that right after the election results, I was remembering how we felt during the early months and first couple of years of the pandemic, where we all had to face the same thing. We all had to look at it. You couldn't look away. There's no way to hide or avoid or negate or be in denial or to remove yourself. And I think that we're entering into another period like that.
Well, what's interesting to sort of, connect the dots here, you say there's no way to remove yourself. There wasn't. And you're saying we're probably moving into a time now where you can't remove yourself. But in the episode that our current guest was on, she made that statement where she said if the Black middle class were to package itself differently, we would be an economic boon to countries that would give us friendly visas. And after that broadcast, a friend of yours who works for a nonprofit said to you, well, what about the working class? What about the poor? Is the Black middle class just going to up and go?
Yeah.
And, it's interesting. You and I, often have these conversations around, should we go? Should we stay? What does it mean to go? Does this start a whole new era of colonization or gentrification elsewhere? Did we just displace our situations in the US to other places? And so, it's just kind of an interesting thing, but, you definitely fall in a camp very different from mine. And I'm sort of like, well, what about our agency? What about, our ability not to suffer? Why should we suffer through some of the stuff if we don't have to? So, this, I'm looking forward to hearing what our guest Malia will say, what she has to say about these things.
Well, let's also make clear, I'm not eager to be suffering. I'm talking more about accompanying and bearing witness. If you have the agency, you have the resource to get up and leave. You also have potentially the agency and resource to stay and deepen community connections and impact. So how do you do it? Or can you do both? And so I think, again, our guest today is going to help us flesh that out because that's just how her brain works. So let's go ahead and welcome Malia Lazu, who is a business consultant and lecturer at MIT's Sloan Business School and author of the recently published From Intention to Impact, a practical guide to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Come on back, Malia.
Hello. It's so great to be back. I so enjoyed our conversation the first time, and I'm glad it got people thinking, especially about class, because that's really important. Can I jump in? Because, y'all were talking and I had to take some notes because I was already getting excited. And this is why I wish, we could do this weekly with drinks in front of us and, just in wax philosophic for hours. But, the first thing that you said that struck me, Derek, was have we evolved? Right? Are we evolving? And I would say that as a society, and I want to be specific, I am talking about Americans, specifically Western culture broadly, right? So I'm talking about people who believe in a white manifest destiny, not a Japanese or a Chinese manifest destiny. Derek could explain that society in Japan better than I could, right? But what we're talking about is the people who believe in manifest destiny enough to enslave and kill indigenous people because God said it was okay. And we are the outcomes of that, right? So
can we just take that in? We are the outcomes of that. I just want
to. Right? You are here.
That is part of our identity. It's part of our makeup. Yes, that is it.
Right. And in many ways, as Black people in America, some might say we are the most privileged of all the diaspora, right? Now, it depends what indicators you're using and this and that. And as we talk about class, we'll get a little more into that, right? But so as a society, are we evolving? No, we're probably more in a devolution, right? We're cycle, as seems to happen historically, right? But I think as individuals, I'm seeing, especially with the younger generations, that they're accepting responsibility that boomers and X's just aren't taking, right? Because they know we will have no air.
That's right.
We will have no water, right? Their existential crises are real.
That's right.
Right. And they don't have the power to do anything about it. So I think, I think it's sort of like, you have, evil and you have good, right? Like, you have the two things happening at once. But the big question is what does American capitalism allow for? And I think that's where, we need to understand that we are a part of a system that trains us to want material things more than health, right? More than, a lot of our conversation last time, I remember we're talking about like versus fascism, right? Like, right? Like, and somehow the cost of eggs is more important than your daughter being able to have an abortion if she is raped in certain states, right? Like somehow those two things become equivalent. And that's the
and opposed, and as if they're opposed, as if they're
exactly. Right. Like, so, our economy is more important than anything else in American capitalism.
Absolutely.
And so that prevents evolution, right? If I can't get funding because it doesn't align with a capitalist, donor or, philanthropy, right? As someone who raised money for 15 years, I can tell you that's why I got out of the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Because I was like, wait a second, if you have access to wealth, if you have this, if you have that, you can have you a nonprofit, right? A majority are run by white folks, right? Like it mimics capitalism in benevolent space, right? Like, so this idea that I think, Derek, we have agency, but what do we have agency in, right? Can the three of us change American capitalism? No, right? We would have to organize a movement. We would, right? Like we would need people to do that and stuff. So I think like, as we think about just where we are and how we get that resolution, it's important for us to remember that there are systems in place so that you never have resolution. And those include killing activists, right? And I'm not talking about Martin Luther King, although that was the big one, Malcolm X. I'm talking about Medgar Evers, right? I'm talking about the people who were living throughout this country doing work who were killed because of doing the work, which then has a chilling effect, right? So those systems that make you want to move out of the hood because your kids need to get a better schooling, right? That belief is a limiting belief if you want to evolve Black people in a society, right? What we actually need is freedom schools, and we need to, right? Like, so, just to get started, that was just, as you guys were talking, I was like, yes, so those are just some initial thoughts. But I'm glad to be back. Thank you.
So wait, that was the initial thought, because you just threw us into the deep end real fast. Like you're like, here you go, sink or swim. So yeah, you just
y'all know me. This isn't our first time meeting.
No. I just thought it gave me a little bit of a chuckle. I'm like, oh, this is just my initial thought. I'm like,
right.
Okay,
I'm like, these are my response thoughts. Well, because what you guys were seeing, I think it's so much at the core of even that statement, right? Like when I said, so migration is a part of history, right? Like, we like when it happens in settler colonialism is wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And Melanie, I think that's what you're talking about wanting to prevent, right? Or Derek, or when you guys talk, right? We don't want to be settler colonists, right? That's not
we need to know that we don't want to be that. I'm questioning our consciousness about that.
Absolutely. And I think our consciousness about it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Because we think we can somehow find liberation and still live in Milton and have our middle classness here. And, I think we forget, or maybe it's just really miserable to walk around knowing all day, which I will also admit, is that where we sit in this caste structure, as Isabella, Wilkerson reminded us of, right, is at the bottom. And so the Beyoncés, the Jake, right, the Oprah, the randos, there was millionaires when there were sharecroppers, right? Like, so I think you're right. Like this idea of what is our consciousness? Materialist ministries in church, not helpful, right? We are being trained to be some of the best consumers in the world if we haven't been already, right? So that is a limiting belief, Melanie, absolutely. And it doesn't allow us to think about things the way we're talking about them right now, right? But that's what's great about this podcast, right? Because you can't, if like Timothy Snyder says, the difference between one person writing it down and no one writing it down is the world. Right? We have to actually start the conversation because there are people in this country right now who are moving, who are giving things up, right? Who are going deeper in community. I mean, that's what I'm about to do, right? Like, there are people who will hear this and be able to add on, right? And be like, yes, in the way I'm building consciousness. I mean, unions are striking in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of years. Right? That's a consciousness that's coming up, right? About class. So important, right? So I think we do have a limited consciousness. I think we do have limiting beliefs, again, because of what capitalism tells us will make us happy.
And I would just add to that, I think...
Go ahead,
Melanie. No, go ahead.
Well, first, let me just also acknowledge, especially you're talking about, it sounds like you're talking about giving things up. So I want to hear more about that. Because I will admit I'm somebody who's terrified of that, frankly. And you're talking about going deeper into community. And I just want to acknowledge that you are in Hawaii. And so we may on this podcast hear roosters in the background where you are, as I heard them earlier on. I got on the call. So just to situate.
Right. You might be hearing a lot of bird noises from my microphone. And, yeah, I mean, and being in Hawaii, especially, I'm going to be putting out a whole thing about this, but the settler colonialism is almost complete now, right? There's more Hawaiians who have been displaced outside of Hawaii than can live in the state, right? And so I walk around and I go to places that used to look more like me, right? More local. And it's just not there. But what you're also seeing is less consideration, more disrespect for the land, right? You're seeing the manifest destiny colonial that comes out of Europe that we've adopted and the West has adopted. You see how it destroys what is beautiful, right? In order to sell what is beautiful. And so, yeah, if you hear the chickens and roosters, they get to run free on my mother's land. And that's something that, you will be hearing. But, yeah, I think it is I don't know, Derek, you were going to say something because I was going to jump into giving things up. So go ahead before I take us down another.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. No, I was just thinking that in addition to us being trained to be consumers, we're also trained to be profiteers. We're trained to profit off of the poor and of systems that keep people poor because there's just no reason.
As if we're not, right.
Right.
It's like everyone's a capitalist now, even though you ain't got no real money.
Right. But also just thinking about the country as a whole, there's no reason that as one of the richest countries in the world, if not the richest, we should have such entrenched poverty for generations and over such a widely dispersed area. It just doesn't make sense. But,
but it makes sense if I tell you that poor people are lazy. It makes sense if I tell you that poor people don't work, none of which is true, right? Some of the hardest workers I know are working class people. Right.
Right.
But I think it also makes sense because that's what the system is designed to do and to do very well. I mean, I noticed you said we're taking certain kind of desires and impulses that came out of Europe. But honestly, I'm like, no, what we've done is like steroidize it, steroized, put on steroids. Whatever those initial impulses were that got people here doing violence and genocide, we've taken it to a whole level. Like, so to me, Europe is a place to go to learn how to be more communal and conscious.
I mean, unless you're being put on a plane to Rwanda or you're sitting in a boat trying to get up. Right. And I mean, it's less violent in the sense that they have social systems
That's
for
right.
themselves that they're now trying to cut off, right? Because the colonies are coming in. So now NHS is not a good thing, right? And it shouldn't be for everybody. You know, what I like to say, the difference between us and Europe is that we were settler colonialists, right? Like we were living with the people we were colonizing. So all the whites of America saw slaves, saw this happening in their country, right? If you're in Spain during colonial times or in England, or that was happening over there, right? And that's what capitalists were going to do. They were going to Haiti. They were going to these places. They were buying slaves. They were buying ships. They were getting, you know, commissions from royalty, right? To enslave people, to steal things, to bring it back home. That wasn't the feudal, right? That wasn't the folks living in Londinium or whatever. Maybe it was called London at that time, right? Like that wasn't those folks, right? Here, we had to convince in many ways the poor whites that it was beneficial to have free labor.
That's
Right?
right.
That's a mind fuck. That's a total mind fuck.
Yeah.
You know, so you hate me for taking your job, but if we all got together, they would have to pay all of us, right? But then we fear,
That's right.
well, what happens if they say no, right? What happens if now we're all jobless? But if we're all jobless, what happens is the American economy has to shift.
That's right.
Right. And so to talk about to talk about having to give things up. And I think this is something that, you know, let me put it this way. I come out of, I want to just say this because, you know, people will have different things and that's fine. Some people believe in the system. I do not. Right. I think this system was built to do exactly what it's doing. I think Trump is going to do the tune-up it needs. Right. I think, you know, we had like, you know, the movements of the 20s, right? The movements of the 50s and 60s, right? And Trump's going to take all that back and we're going to go back to Jim Crow and he's going to retune it to what it was. And so because I believe that, then the options that I see, right? Like, have me recognizing that you can't want all the benefits from capitalism, which you get by oppressing poor people, primarily people of color in this country, and want people of color to not be oppressed, right? Because the system doesn't allow for that. And that's why when, you know, they say rage against the machine, right? You know, break the system.
Yeah.
We have to, because, and what we've done in many ways, right, is we've said, well, hey, we don't have slavery. I mean, we do in prisons and with prison labor, but we don't have slavery here, but we all support slavery in China and that's cool. And I'm still going to buy my disposable clothing and my cell phone. And even though I know people are literally jumping out of windows and they're putting nets, right, to stop the suicides in this factory, which sounds a lot like a plantation to me.
Yes.
Right? Like, oh, well, my iPhone is amazing. Right? And I think that's what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we actually have to, and I'm going to use your word, Melanie, reckon with.
Yeah.
Right? What we have to reckon with is that if you like your middle class life, and I like my middle class life, right? If you want to change this, that might change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And how are we okay with that? And I think what we need to start seeing is there actually more value in thriving Black communities?
Yeah.
Than in my living primarily with white folks, or you know, whatever people choose to show that they're middle class, right? I know we're all hood dwellers, right? Like, but you know, like,
say I'm a hood dweller. That's the thing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
But
so
you come from the hood in the past.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I moved out to get into a good neighborhood.
And so I'm like, I work darn intentionally, let's say. In so many ways escape what I felt limited by growing up, that I was just like, this is not
right. And that Thank
We all
you
have
for
them.
that, because that's the lesson. You were told that the only way to get out of your limited Black community was to do this road that leads you to more of a white, heteronormative,
Hard one.
right?
I mean, I'm in a queer community, but that's itself very middle class, right? To be in a neighborhood where certain values are upheld and protected and promoted,
Where people can choose to live, right, in a protected place.
Convene. Yeah. And so my neighbors are largely white, even though this neighborhood in the 70s was a neighborhood where only the immigrants and the queers and activists would settle.
Right.
Now it's like lots of people want to be this close to the parks. And so, but therefore the only people who can afford to do it are more white than ever. So that's stunning. And I
Right, and more institutional.
gotten to a place,
Right.
I own a house in such a place, right? And like it's like against all stupid odds. Like
That's right. You're an amazing exception.
it's ridiculous. And so it's terrifying, one, to expect to hold on to it as things change, but also mind-boggling to consider not being so committed to holding on to it. And I think this is what we're talking about.
That's
It's
it.
polarizing.
It's an anti-striving.
Let me ask a potentially polarizing question.
Go ahead, Derek.
Given that for 350 some odd years, Black communities were stripped of their wealth, they were prevented from accessing wealth or building wealth. Once the country was allowed to integrate or allowed to be a little bit more equitable, was there anywhere else to go but into more white dominated spaces?
Yes, there was. Right. And at the time, and I'm going to have to find the name of this book. I want to say it's called Blackness and American Capitalism, something like that. Right. But at the time, there were conversations about what we built for ourselves. Right. And what does it mean to have that extra? Right. Because a lot of what you're saying, Derek, is right in narrative. But I don't know if the data, especially now with how wealthy billionaires have gotten and seeing what happens, in the Me Too movement, right? Like seeing how Black folks are targeted to lose their wealth first anyway.
Yeah.
Like, I think we sit in that comfort a little too much. I don't know how true it is, right? But let's say, right, that we're now at another place where we have a Black middle class, just like we did during Jim Crow, right? I mean, those Black Wall Streets that were burnt down, right, they were building wealth and things like that. So then what do you do with that, right? Because in America, wealth is power, right? So do you spend a lot of money to get a nice house, or, do you rent things at market rate to whoever can afford them? Right? Or do you take a little bit of an L to help Black people get up? Right? And it's in those questions, like I know, Derek and I talk about this a lot. For me, I want to honor and love the fact that Black people can close the wealth gap by buying property. Unless I'm in an Indian reservation. And then the idea that the people who should understand what the indigenous folks went through the most, right? And people who helped us in some places, right? Be able to be free. That we would forget that their land isn't just stolen from the whites. We're buying stolen goods, right? We're fencing stolen product right now. And not that we should then say, well, then what do we do? Should we all be homeless? No. Right? But should we pay tax to the indigenous tribes by where we live without being asked? Yes. Right? If you don't have children, should you think about inheritance differently? And should you look at giving it back to the tribes? Right? If you don't have no kids to leave it to, and if you do have kids to leave it to, is inheritance the best thing for them? It doesn't seem to be. When you look at Elon Musk and people with generational wealth, they seem to lose a moral compass. Right? So I think the question becomes, Are you seeing things as your individual capitalism, right? And I worked hard and this and that, so therefore I am deserving of this? Or do you see it as I was one of the lucky ones who was able to get into the front of the line of Blackness, right? Like, not the front of the line of anything else, all right? But, and so rather than seeing that as an accomplishment that needs to be protected, this is why I think I differ from a lot of folks. Right? I see it as an opportunity and a privilege to then bring other folks along so we can actually have enough soldiers to fight a war.
You have to believe that there's something you can do that's enough. So I hear you and I'm following you, and I think then there's like the despair. It's the same feelings about the climate. It's like, how can I do such a thing collectively enough such that there's that kind of broader impact? Because, I do want to make sure to preserve this wealth and give it on to whatever. But if there's something that's productive to do in the meantime that can impact a broad base of people with me or others like me at this, proverbial front of the line, how do I hold that value or that expectation or that desire along with others such that we do this in a collective way such that there is that?
Yes. So we get into community.
However, we've also had this conversation, Melanie, in a previous conversation, where there has to be this mutual sense of not just giving, but also being accepting. So the person to whom you want to give the aid, you want to give the assistance, a lot of times we've had a couple of conversations, people don't want that. They're like, I don't want your charity. I don't want your assistance. So like, how do we also...
I don't think about one-to-one. Are you talking about one-to-one or are you talking...
No, we're talking about collective. Well, I'm talking about collective, right? So like there's this great group called Right to the Land. And what they do is they believe that foreclosed houses and that, should be in the hands of homeless families, right? That a pile of papers, which they define as the bank, right? Which is basically what a bank is, right? It's a pile of papers, does not have more right to that foreclosed land than a family who needs a home, right?
No
so
argument.
You could start supporting them.
Yeah.
Right? You could start, and I think what we want to remember is we tell the civil rights movement as if it was everybody, right? Like Harry always used to joke and say, if everyone who said that they were on the Edmund Pettus Bridge were on the bridge, it would have fallen. Right? Like,
first of all, I just love that you just invoked Harry Belafonte. My heart is swelling.
And here another Harry story to keep on the Harry stories.
Yes, go ahead.
So when we were organizing the Gathering for Justice for Harry, he brought in all the elders. So I'm talking Diane Nash, right? Marion Wright Edelman, just like the folks who had been bitten by dogs, right? All of those folks. And one of them was Bernard Lafayette. And he was the nonviolent trainer of the civil rights movement. He was out of SCLC. He trained SNCC, right? Like he was James Lawson's mentee, right? So he comes direct line like James and him, right? And so this dude is well respected, right? Like you can't question his bona fides. He was actually part of the group that helped build the ceasefire and peace in Colombia with the FARC, right? Like doing real stuff. And they got together and, you had your, what I like to say, your suits of the middle class, right? Oh, I got elected. Oh, I have a good job now because where else, right? Like I was able to do this. And they start talking about, well, what are we going to do with the criminal justice system, this and that. And Bernard gets up, Dr. Lafayette gets up and he says, none of you all turned with Martin when he went to the Poor People's Movement.
Yeah.
And he starts reading them, right? In a way that none of us could because we wasn't there. We think they're all great. And he was like, y'all didn't want to be around poor people then, and you don't want to be around poor people now.
Yeah.
And it was like this thing where I was like, wait a second. The civil rights movement didn't want to be around poor people. You know what I'm saying? Like, and again, Bernard can answer.
group of people.
Exactly, right? And Bernard can answer more of the actual going ons, right? Of why he said that. But I tell you what, no one counted him.
Yeah.
Right? No one said, that's bullshit. You know, we was there with the ba 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 ba.
Right.
No one said that. Right? And so what I think is important for us to remember, or for us to think about too, is like, we have to have a class conversation and revolution within ourselves, right? To be like, is this like what we're holding on to, right? Our middle classness is a fucking illusion. So you know what? Take it. Like fuck it. Like, and to be honest, and I don't know if this is with you all, I prefer the community I had when I was working class. We had to be more interdependent on one another. At the end of the day, there was a lot less embarrassment because everyone behind everyone's door was a Pandora's box of some bullshit, right? Like, there was actually things that I had then that I've had to build now and find the middle class people who are down for that, right? And are down for that kind of interconnectedness, right? So, you know, this rugged individualism is what we have to lose. And I think we're never going to get everyone to do it, but you find the people who are doing it. And then you say, I am going to support you, right? Like if I have extra money, right, it's going to you. And I define extra money in this way, right? My kids don't get the third, you know, trip to Disney World a year, right? We spend that one vacation. We're going to give it to Right to the Land. We're going to give it to, you know, the Domestic Workers Alliance, right? And I may show up and I may say, hey, you know, I'm a real estate guru and I can help you all figure out how you can start with one piece of property. We can da-da-da-da-da. You know, you might get some pushback because private ownership, right? But great, let me learn that. Let me feel that, right? Let me have a conversation with myself about how my idea of housing people can be made better. Right? Like, so it is a change in mind shift. And to be honest, like, and I think we talked about this a little bit as well, like, I don't think Americans and American Blacks are the ones who do it. Right? Like, I think we actually see it in other places and we get as far as we can in empire. Right?
I want to make sure American Blacks do what?
I don't think we actually become the revolutionary class of the diaspora. Right? Like, I think that, you know, that we're going to see things happening in Brazil and, right, we've seen things in Cuba, right? To know that while Cuba and Haiti, right, and we have the civil rights movement, right? Like, which is very different than even what's going on in Brazil right now, right? So, you know, I think it's important for us to remember that we are very much indoctrinated, but there are people in this country who are trying to go as liberatory as they can. And those are the people that you want your kids going to school with, right? Those are the people, you know, like don't be a Drake when you can be a Kendrick.
So we don't have a whole lot of time left and so much to cover, but I'm running out of time as always. Can you just say a little bit more about some of the people who are doing the things for liberatory action?
Yes. So let me say this, that there's like the folks I'm going to name are within my purview, right? So this is in no way, there are amazing folks doing amazing work. But right to the land, what Jubilee is doing down south, like Jubilee is helping farmers, Black farmers take their land. Because what was happening, again, as we talk about, you know, what's happening back then and today, right? Like what's happening right now is predatory lending practices. So Black farmers are losing their land, right? Those are a couple of really powerful. The Black Imagination Lab is doing some really incredible stuff. You know, the Black Futures Lab that Alicia Garza put together, right, is doing some incredible stuff. Don't sleep on Black union organizing.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of us are working class folks and could benefit from a union. I mean, including those who are middle class, white collar jobs, we could probably benefit from a union, right? Supporting unions. Depending on the chapter, you may have a good Black Lives Matters chapter, in your area, right? There's always a resist, right? And a lot of cities, right? Again, these are going to be the people, Ujima in Boston, right? Like I like to say, like, if you want to think about investing or anything like that, do it as close to Ujima as you can, right? Like Ujima is one of our beacons, right? And you want to get as close to them as you can. Now, they literally have a way to not take money, right? Because they say, we're only taking money from you if you believe in Black liberation. So, so for them, they have to say no to a lot of money, right? Again, getting to what you're giving up. But because they say no to that money, they can give how they want to give, right? And they can make sure that, any default is handled with dignity and with reparations, right? They can make sure of these things. So, definitely look up local. I think local organizations or organizations that have strong local chapters, there are, they exist, right? Like, and finding them is possible. And I'm going to tell you that because Derek, you mentioned something about they don't want the help, they don't want the da-da-da-da.
Well, I'm not saying that as universal. I'm just saying that.
No, but you were saying that as certain individuals, right?
Yeah.
And I think that makes sense, right? None of us want to be a charity case.
Absolutely.
Right. But what we're talking about, and I'm just using what you said to make this point, is we're talking about creating a collective that is interdependent on one another without hierarchy. Right? So I'm not dependent on you because you're my manager or because you're my donor or because you're my this and that. And that's what we have right now, right? We can't take our lips off of, the donor's teats.
Yeah.
Right? When that wasn't the case, like the civil rights movement did not have right? Like, so if I look at it, then I want less right? Like, then what are we doing? Like, maybe what we actually need, right? What is it? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? Maybe comfort makes us complicit.
Yes. Reach. Yeah. I mean, listen, donors to donate, to be a philanthropist is a tax strategy.
That's all it is. And if they paid their tax, right? Like, and this is why Europe, to bring it all around, look, we have a connection. Europe, you pay a shitload of tax.
Absolutely.
And their poverty isn't as violent because folks can go to a doctor.
That's right. There's more equity.
And get an education.
Right. And they have rich people. Right. They have oligarchs. Right. Now, we can get into the monarchs and all of that. But right. So it's not that it doesn't exist. It's not that inequality doesn't exist there. Right. They have their own things, but poverty is less violent there in the sense of you can go to a doctor, you can go to school, right? You can do things that you can't do here without putting yourself woefully in debt.
Because so much too of our tax base is tied to real estate, and who owns, and the people who own and are paying taxes have a lot of say in how that money gets spent. And who doesn't own property? The people who need equitable benefits more than anyone else.
Right. And who were systemically put out.
Systemically excluded, and still are, really.
Yeah.
Right, by default. And so that is uniquely us.
Yep. And that's why these conversations, and I know we're coming to time, and maybe part of what we do when we're together on these calls is, push forward, but not have the resolution, right? Because I think we need to have at least, 200,000 hours per community of this conversation, right? Like, you don't just come to this conversation. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things I saw was, do you remember when Tua, the football player, when he got conked out twice in a row, because he was playing football and like he was concussed and literally like he started shaking because he had just had a concussion, but they put him back out and he got another concussion. And, and folks were like, yo, this needs to stop. Like, we can't do this. Like, this ain't cool. And there were football players who were like, this is how we're going to get out of the hood. You can't tell me I can't make my money. He knows what, right? And it's like, wow, you would rather have your money spent by your wife's next husband while you're in a home being fed because your brain is mush than you being there to be able to raise your kids, right? And you are fighting for your right to have your brain be mush so that your kids can be, right? This is how, this is the programming that would be helpful for us to deprogram.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 100%.
Woo!
Yeah.
We're going to have you back.
Listen, can we just decide that either I come back once a quarter? Like, I think we should just have Malia Hour. I can even be once a month because I love talking to you all. And what I love about it too is because Melanie, you and Derek you guys are so helpful for me to, it helps me realize how we have to love ourselves through this.
Yeah.
Because there's like a lot of folks who, who I work with and who I come up with, right? It's like, no, we got to reject this and like, da-da-da-da-da. But how do we reject it in a way that keeps us feeling empowered, right? And I think, with the two of you, especially like the involvement in real estate and all that, it's like, right, like, let's think about how we actually do this in a way that it is liberatory, right? Because that's why I believe in the Black middle class, right? And why I say, let's not, the working class, to answer the question, the reason why I don't talk about poor and working class a lot, and it's not that there are things for them to do and they are doing it. They are staying alive.
Right.
So let's have them keep doing that. And if they have time to show up,
That's right.
amen. Let's make sure we have food. Let's make sure we have childcare. Let's make sure we have all the things for them to show up. But if they decide that they would rather sleep,
That's right.
that's cool. Because I get that. I get 3-job living. We all get 3-job living.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
And so
I grew up with that.
right,
And
we
it's
all
like,
grew up with 3-job living. Exactly.
I had it in my
And so
lifetime.
we know how tired our mamas are. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I've done it.
Yeah, exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Like, so to the person who asked, like, well, what we need to do with working class folks is we need to love on them and we need to give them as much money and possibility as we can. We need to show up for their strikes. Did y'all cancel Amazon? Right? Like, if you want to show up for working class people,
Intervention.
tell me about it.
You need an Amazon intervention.
Tell me about it. Just know that he's about to spend $600 million on his second or third wedding, whatever it is. And that's because we like to get things quick. And it's hard. I mean,
well, no, it's not just that. Okay, we do need to end this and we'll have another. It's because they've completely obliterated supply chains. So you don't have local shops that you can run down the street and get the thing. It's even to the point now that Whole Foods doesn't have the things that I want to pick up because you have to buy it online from Amazon. So they have destroyed.
Or you can buy from local group or, you can buy from independent retailers online.
More.
Like, that's where I get my bone broth and stuff. But it's so hard and it's more expensive.
Yes. I don't mind that. I want it.
So you don't, but I'm saying for a lot of people, right? Like, they get us on this team.
This can't. Exactly. But this is how it's like we're twisted, we're contorted into this choosing.
Right.
Conscious choosing.
Although I'll say this, like, wait, the last thing I want to say, because I think it's a good example to what Melanie's saying is like, I love seeing the farmers markets in Roxbury.
Yeah.
Right. And what you see there are Black and brown and Asian folks buying fruits and buying things, right? Like, we had that before, right? We were much more of a collective when we could be, but they turned us into rugged individuals. So now we think we can be like them, even though they didn't change the system. Yeah. But yeah, so support, farmers markets, like, again, not you guys, because we already do this, right? But as people are thinking, right, you don't have to change everything, but is there one thing you're going to do? Right? Are you going to decide that all Christmas gifts come from Black and brown businesses?
For example, I love, to me, this kicks us into what our next episode will be, Derek, is with Malia. Our next conversation with Malia is really
so you're
about
definitely coming back, Malia.
yes, quarterly at least. So what is our role? What is our responsibility to each other to be a purposeful Black middle class that is conscious? That's, I think, what we want to dive in.
And actually, I love that. And let's I'll have books, you know what I mean? Because maybe what we can do too, if your listeners are interested, we can, I don't want to say a book club, but, start a community of practice from the Black Lining podcast that allows us to actually wrestle with this, and I know some folks that we can bring in, like Prentice, and, folks who are doing this on the ground now, who can, help us know how they can get involved, but also help us sit with this, right? Because I like things too, and I like to say, the minute the revolution is real, I'll give it all up. But, y'all ain't right. We ain't ready for no revolution.
I'm like, I'm getting ready to have all the gear for such moment where everything is to be given up, not just for revolution, but for climate collapse. Honestly. So I'm like, I want to be ready, but in the meantime, I want to be ready.
But we also have to still get out of our own way. We still have to get out of our own way. And that's the thing. So we all know we're all middle class. We all know other middle class people. One of the people who listens to this podcast, a good friend of mine, often comments on the episodes. When we have conversations that are not about this, they're just about day-to-day living. I'm like, when are you going to get out of your own way? She's like, I know. I said this a month ago. I said this 6 months ago. I said this a year ago. I'm like, yes, you say you want this. You say that you want this done. But when are you going to get out of your own way so that you can get this done? So, and that's just on a basic thing. That's just sort of I need to put up a shelf in my house. Now we're talking about something that's much greater, much grander, much more potent than that. So it's kind of like, how do we get all these middle-class people who either are so attached to their belongings, to their possessions, to their comfort, to their style of living? How do we get them to stop thinking about the shelf, to go past the shelf on their wall to a movement, or even just to a reading or a book club or something? That's the piece where it's kind of like, I would really want to dive into that.
Okay.
Right. How to put a Black Lives Matter flag up on your house in Milton. And then show up at the country club and be like, hi, Tom. Hi, Tad. How are you? With your BLM shirt. Right? Because things like that, as small as they are, those are the things. We can't do systems change, but we can do systems disruption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love you guys.
We are definitely a time. I know that you guys have to go because you have commitments after this.
Yeah.
But Malia, thank you again for joining us. For folks who are listening, I mean, especially those who commented to me and Melanie, please continue commenting because that helps drive the direction of our conversations, and we really do use that feedback to drive us. So we appreciate feedback. But with that in mind, so let this soak in, let this sink in, and we will see you all on the next episode of the Black Lining Forum. Take care.